So, we haven't often kept up with our recaps in the raid as much as we did in Mythic Plus, but this week does perhaps have a little bit more value since we are getting changes, we're getting balance tuning to the specs, so more things are bound to be changing in the raid as well compared to Mythic Plus. Generally, things in the raid tend to be more stale, tend to remain a little bit more stale compared to Mythic Plus, especially if you consider that, for example, Blizzard used to, at the very least, tend to nerf more dungeons in Mythic Plus more often, for example, and it tend to change specs in single target and in AoE, but for the raid, what is generally more important is single target, whereas for Mythic Plus, it also matters if you get changed in AoE damage, for example. So things in Mythic Plus tend to go up and down, change left and right a little bit more than the raid. But this week, at least, we do have some changes, we do have some nerfs, especially to the Exodia specs of Mythic Plus, as well as some buffs to some of the other specs. We have Holy Priest being buffed, we have Outlaw, Fury, we have Unholy, we have Marksmanship Hunter, as well as Frost Mage, all getting buffed. So this is our current situation in the raid, which sees a top half, we can say a top third of the specs being dominated by ranged DPS. This is something we have been mentioning quite often since the beginning of this expansion. As you can see here, we have Mage, Augmentation, Affliction, Demo, Frost, Arcane, and Shadow Priest. The only two breaking the combo of ranged domination are Unholy and Enhancement Shaman. Now, these two specs are also quite different in Mythic Plus in the sense that Enhancement still stays quite a strong spec in Mythic Plus. It was one of the main choices to be a meta pick before Exodia came in and rendered them homeless and jobless in Mythic Plus. Meanwhile, Unholy, not really. Unholy has been shit for a while in Mythic Plus and has been replaced as an option if you even want to run with a Death Knight in Mythic Plus by Frost. So at least they retain their high value, their S tier value in the raid as well. Now, for the range DPS, we do have three familiar faces, unfortunately, we can say, being at the top, because the three specs that dominate Mythic Plus are also currently at the top in the raid, with the fourth extra of Demonology Warlock. Not surprised that in the healing camp we also have Holy Paladin being at the top of the performance. Now, we are getting, of course, nerfs. So, starting with the current top of damage is Fire. The Fire is getting predominantly a nerf to AoE, which means the majority of the damage that is going to matter for many of the bosses is not going to impact Fire Mage that much. Because when you look at the damage in the raid, right, you have many bosses in here, from Magmorax to Rashok, which are pure single target. So all this AoE nerf will do nothing to Fire Mage. And then you have some AoE phases or some AoE targets which are not that important. For example, the AoE of the ads of Sarkaret is very not important. The AoE on the golems of Zuskarn is not really that relevant either, as well as the AoE in the basically very last phase of Neltharion is also not super relevant. It is the more important of the bosses in terms of AoE damage, but still, having Fire Mage being nerfed specifically in AoE is not going to impact the performance that much, even if we go boss by boss and not just look at the overall. A pure single target boss like Magmorax, Fire Mage is towards the top. A boss with some ads added like Neltharion, Fire Mage is still towards the top, as well as back to another single target with some ads. Fire Mage is losing out much more because usually you don't play Fire Mage nearly as much on this boss. So this AoE nerf is going to be more impactful in Mythic Plus. Unfortunately, the advantage Fire Mage has in Mythic Plus with other specs is so far ahead of the rest that this is not going to impact the spec too much. In the same class, you also get Frost Mage. You have Comet Storm, Blizzard, and Frozen Orb. However, these are still used in single target, or at least they can contribute to more single target damage than these spells can for a Fire Mage. And Frost Mage, as I mentioned, is often misleadingly considered not nearly as strong simply because Fire Mage is OP. But Frost Mage is still performing very well. They still have very good overall damage compared to most of the other specs. Same goes for Mythic Plus. They are being overshadowed by fire, but they still remain a very strong spec. So this nerf of Frost will still impact them, not nearly as much as the AoE nerf of Fire Mage, but still weaken out their performance by a little bit. You do have also some buffs, which are not that important in the raid, the one to marksmanship as well as the one to unholy, because these are purely AoE based, epidemic and bursting source for unholy, as well as multi-shot and explosive shot for marksmanship. These are more aimed at AoE and Mythic Plus. So unholy is of course already doing more than well enough in the raid, so this buff to AoE won't really impact them that much. Maybe some improvement in doing even more AoE damage on Neltarion in the last phase to the adds, but even then, most of the groups have a pre-planned Power Infusion, Bloodlust, Potion, Evoker buffs given to the Unholy Death Knight to do exclusively single target in that phase. It's very often that the Unholy DK will just ignore the adds to do pure single target, so not even this AoE buff will actually do much for Unholy in the raid either. And then you have the poor marksmanship, which does get some AoE buffs, but marksmanship is already doing quite poorly, and as we mentioned, not much AoE goes off in the raid for you to gain that much value as a marksmanship hunter. Talking about nerfs, we also have perhaps the ones that will impact more, the ones that will be felt more by the specs are the ones to Holy Paladin as well as the ones to Shadow Priest, because Holy Paladin wasn't really as strong in the raid as it was in Mythic Plus. Their performance right now still shows up as the better healer, but as you can see already, in terms of the very highs, the high highs of the specs, you already have 2 specs plus a possible third on their tail, and this is pre-nerf. You know, if you increase the percentile, you know, if you get towards the higher percentiles, it starts to get to be even more blurred. The potential, yeah, the max HPS potential of the healers have a higher ceiling for pure HPS specs like these 3 compared to Holy Paladin. And now Holy Paladin is getting nerfed in healing. He's getting nerfed in multiple of their healing abilities. They are getting, first of all, a flat 5% healing nerf, which is already quite big, and on top of that they are getting, you know, further nerfs like Overflowing Light having a weaker absorb shield, weaker bonus healing to their Tears Deliverance. You have less absorb shield with your Fading Light. All of this will amount towards an almost 10% healing nerf in the raid. So with this nerf coming, Holy Paladin should drop comfortably below both of these specs, and now much more even and tied with Preservation Evoker. So all of their position you see right now as a comfortable S tier spec in the raid, in whichever tier list you might look at, it is likely to go down. So that's perhaps the first of the Exodia specs to be receiving a nerf that becomes visible in game in the raid, not yet in Mythic Plus, but definitely in the raid, it will be a visible nerf to this spec. The other one that might be a bit more visible is Shadow Priest. And that's because Shadow Priest is, as we mentioned, towards the top half of performers, but it's at the very low end. You know, Shadow Priest is not one of the better performing single target specs. If we have to go to our default target dummy, which is Magmorax, you can see that Shadow Priest is not one of the better single target performers on Magmorax. So when it comes to the nerfs to Shadow Priest, unfortunately for them, or maybe fortunately because they deserved it, whichever is your opinion on this, they are getting Vampiric Touch, Shadow War Pain, and Shadowy Apparition nerfed. These are not AoE nerfs. These are nerfs that will impact the entirety of the specs. So it's not like the nerfs to Fire Mage, for example, where just exclusively their AoE spells were being nerfed. This one for Shadow Priest, for example, if we go and look at one of the high-level bosses like Echo of Neltarion, we pick a random Chinese guy. We are hoping there is a Shadow Priest in their group, and we fail, so we pick another Shadow Priest guy in this group, which will surely be, no, won't be here either. What do Taiwanese people have against the Shadow Priest? There you go. If you pick a random Shadow Priest, you can see that Vampiric Touch, as well as Shadow War Pain, as well as Shadowy Apparition, do even out to be upwards of 20 to 25% of their damage. So this type of nerf to all of these abilities can even out to be 4 to 5% nerf in single target. And we know that the single target of Shadow Priest is on the low end. So this is one of the few things, much like the one we talked about Holy Paladin, that might change the status of Shadow Priest in terms of power in the raid, because now it is more likely, it is more feasible that a spec with this average DPS getting nerfed, going down to 113, 114,000 DPS, might fall down, all of these specs, which are already performing better than them, by the way, and with another nerf, the specs might be falling down to a much lower DPS. In fact, technically speaking, with this nerf, they should have the lowest single target DPS of pretty much any other spec overall. So together with Holy Paladin, Shadow Priest seems to be the only other one of the Exodia specs which will feel an impact in the nerfs in the raid, at the very least. They are also one of the ones more in danger of being replaced in Mythic class. As I said, this is pure conjecture, but if you were to bet, if you were to name some specs that might be replaced in the Exodia Comp, it could be Holy Paladin for Discipline Priest, it could be Shadow Priest for Ret or Enhancement or Destruction, so they are also more at risk in Mythic Plus after this set of nerfs, although not nearly as much as their power weakening in the raid. In terms of buffs, the last one of the meaningful buffs was the one to Rogue, because Outlaw is getting 5% more damage to abilities and to their auto attack. Now, Outlaw is one of the worst performers in the raid. So, of course, it makes sense, obviously, to buff them by 5%, but 5% is still quite a small number to make them improve significantly, and more importantly, what is always very important for the pure DPS specs, to be able to beat the best spec in your own class. So, as long as you get buffed as an Outlaw, but you are still weaker than Subtlety, it's very likely that players will still just continue to play Subtlety, because it's the strongest spec, even after this buff to Outlaw. So it's a very small buff, it's a very minor buff. At the very least, nowadays, Rogues are full-on high on Hopium, waiting for 10.2, waiting for Season 3, which should be, finally, the patch where Rogues actually do get reworked. So there is plenty more coming the way of Rogues in a few, I guess, weeks. So we'll have to wait and see what Blizzard plans for Rogues. We can then finish with an interesting plot of data, which is our power versus popularity of specs. I think this is interesting because it shows you how many of the players are there of a certain spec compared to how well they are doing. So to give you the TLDR, specs in this quadrant are basically underrated specs because they are doing very well, but they are not played much. They are the niche, underground, hipster, fedora wearing type of nerds. The specs in this quadrant are the hopeless specs, the forgotten specs. They are not only doing badly in terms of DPS, but they're also not popular at all. So these are the worst of the specs in the raid. Then you have this quadrant. This quadrant is the fan favorite quadrant, is the unexplicable quadrant, because these specs are doing terribly, they're shit, but they remain super popular. So it is not a surprise that the leader of this gang is of course Ret Paladin, performing terribly. In fact, the fourth worst DPS spec in the raid. It's also the second most popular. That is their state. You also have some other fan favorites, very familiar faces when we look at the popularity of specs like Beast Mastery, Havoc, and Balance. Currently, all three being, I would say, quite the, speaks for itself. You have Havoc, you have Balance Druid, as well as Beast Mastery Hunter, basically all next to each other. Quite bad performance. Basically similar performance to Feral. In fact, Feral is slightly ahead of them, yet Feral is basically in the forgotten tier of specs. Then you have the center, you have the middle of the pack, you have the default, average group of specs which are averagely popular mixed with averagely performing. Subtlety, Arms, Destruction, those are their positions right now in the meta. And then you have the OP quadrant, the OP spot, this bit right here, the spot where you have specs that are simultaneously super popular but also super performing. That is where you can detect the more out of whack specs. You have some specs right at the edge between underappreciated because they don't get played that much, like Affliction, and OP because they are played a lot while still being strong. This quartet right here, Unholy, Enhancement, Demo, and Frost, which are very well performing right now, but not nearly as popular. Obviously, one might say because they are also not popular in Mythic Plus. There are way more people willing to dump more time into these 3 specs, given that they are also very popular in Mythic Plus as well, compared to these specs, which are not at all, especially these 3. You can excuse Frost, because Frost has to contend, Frost has to fight for fire in the same class. These 3 specs, however, makes more sense for them to not be nearly as popular, given that they are not super popular in Mythic Plus. In this current state of affairs, we do know, of course, that these 3 specs are all getting nerfed in the next patch, or in basically this patch, this new reset getting nerfed. We will see how much of the nerfs will impact these specs in the raid. We know they have a comfy cushion in Mythic Plus. You know, they started from a pretty high up. They started from a pretty large gap compared to the rest of the specs in Mythic Plus. Their gap, their cushion is less big in the raid. They are more liable. It's more possible, it's more feasible that some of the other specs will pass them, will overperform them in the raid. We will see in the following couple of weeks, I guess, how the performances will change in the raid as well, given the set of tuning we have just received in this new hotfix for this new reset. With this out of the way, we are now leaving each other on our beginning of this new reset as well. We are starting, of course, the goodbyes by thanking all of the Patreon supporters for the contribution and the help to the growth of the channel, which can still be done completely for free. You can like and comment down below to help with the YouTube algorithm, and then you can also subscribe to the channel itself. Now, with these things out of the way, thank you guys again for watching. See you guys tomorrow, and in the meantime, oh my god, my throat. My throat is hurting. I need these throat little helpers. Ah, that's better.